This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. I'm Sally Alsop, the committee member responsible for the ICG webinar programme. So for today's webinar, we're delighted to welcome Chris Arning, founder of Creative Semiotics. Chris specialises in semiotics and cultural insight and has 20 years experience working as a thinker, planner, qualitative researcher and commercial semiotician. He was head of semiotics of Flamingo Research and set up Creative Semiotics, a boutique brand consultancy, in 2010. Chris is the originator and co-founder of SemioFest, a celebration of semiotic thinking, and of the LinkedIn Semiotic Thinking Group. He's worked for clients as diverse as the BBC Radio Centre, Netflix, BMW, Mini, GSK, Ricola, Huawei, and UK Trade and Industry. Chris devised and taught the MA module, Brands and Meaning, on Global Media Communications at the University of Warwick and has been a sessional tutor in contextual studies at the University of the Creative Arts. He teaches a critically acclaimed CPD accredited quarterly course, How to Do Semiotics in 7 Weeks, and is currently working on a textbook entitled Brand Semiotics in 25 Diagrams. In this ICG webinar, Chris will be providing examples of core brand problems that Semiotic Insights can help to solve, and some of the different types of semiotics projects he has encountered and worked on. Chris is happy to take questions at the end, or if there's any learning as he goes through. So if you'd like to ask something, please turn on your webcam and raise your hand, or if you'd like me to do this for you, type your comments or questions in the chat box. So before I hand over to Chris, here are some more events. You can see we've got a packed agenda coming forward. So these are the events that we've got planned over the next few weeks. And don't forget that we're able to offer great value sponsorship opportunities with each of our webinars and online events. And please contact Lucy if you'd like to know anything more about that. So I will now hand over to Chris.
Great. Sorry, I cut out there for a second. So.
Right, hang on a second. I've got to find you in the list, Chris. There we go. Why it's not allowing me to make you presenter? Hang on. Oh, looks like you are presenter.
Yeah, I think I am presenter. Yes.
As if
by magic, Sally. As if by magic.
Okay, brilliant. Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Sally, and it's great to be back here at the ICG, and welcome everybody to this webinar. So I published a piece in the paper WARC, the World Advertising Research Council, a few weeks ago, and it sort of sparked a re-establishment of conversations between myself and the ICG. And what I was writing about was the upsurge in interest that I've experienced in semiotics, in inquiries for semiotics projects. And it feels like there's real traction around brand and applied semiotics in the world of brands and marketing, certainly in the UK. And what I'd like to do today is take you through what I consider to be some of the problems that semiotics best, addresses. Because fundamentally, as I've said on this slide, semiotics is problem solving. It's about communication problem solving. It's nice to sort of muse about print ads and ambient media, billboards on the underground or public transport, but ultimately I'm in the business of helping clients solve problems and move towards solutions. And I'm hoping to share some case studies today. The plan for the day for the morning is to share a bit about semiotics, just to get you up to speed if you're not familiar with what it is. to go through some case studies and then just sort of make some reflections about some of the areas I believe semiotics is uniquely suited to as a methodology. Just a few caveats. I'm not going to be teaching you how to do semiotics on this webinar. I do run a course, How to Do Semiotics in 7 weeks, which does that, starts next week, if you're interested. And I'm also not going to be, sharing everything about the case studies that I allude to, but I'll be giving you a flavour of the sort of problem and the solution that was reached. Okay, so semiotics. What is semiotics? Well, it's always a big question. I mean, there's so many ways I could answer this. The formal definition is semiotics comes from the Greek word semion, meaning sign, and it started as a way of thinking about the way in which visual marks and other sorts of marks have meaning for us, but it's sort of graduated into a holistic interdisciplinary system for understanding meaning through pattern recognition. That's the way I see it. It's an interdisciplinary perspective that helps make the invisible visible, and it's what I use to help brands understand culture. And one analogy I would maybe make is that if you're into meditation or mindfulness, you're seeking to observe the habit pattern of the mind. My understanding and my experience of semiotics is that it helps us observe the habit pattern of culture and the categories and areas that products and services and brands move in. So yeah, just back to the definition of visual marks and semion and semiotics is about understanding signs. We have two visual signs here. If you're based in the UK, they're probably both going to be pretty familiar to you. Probably the top one even more so than the bottom one. The top one is, of course, Penguin Books. Usually I would elicit an answer at this point, but given that I'm speaking to a blank wall currently, can't see any faces, I'm going to just go through it. So yes, we have the penguin sign. It's very recognizable. But what semiotics suggests is that visual marks don't just identify an entity. So that's a signifier of a signified. It's a signifier of an entity, which is this imprint, Penguin Books, which is obviously a famous publisher of classic novels and other works of fiction primarily. I would say that it also conveys values. There's a jauntiness to the penguin. Look at the way it's turning to the side and its eyes are fixing you. There's something a little bit cheeky and a little bit surprised about it. So it's not just identifying, it's also conveying connotations of maybe eccentricity, of maybe playfulness. And of course, when we see it, all the associations we have with penguin and the authors come to mind. The bottom sign, you will know, is the visual identifier of the film A Clockwork Orange, the Anthony Burgess novel, which I dare say, I don't know whether it was published by Penguin, but it wouldn't surprise me. And that again identifies the novel, but also there's something a bit sinister about the eye, the cog. It has connotations of being a part of a totalitarian machine. Of course, those that would have seen the film know that it's about intergenerational conflict and social control and brainwashing, etc. So it conveys the themes of the film. So I guess that's a little mini tutorial on the way signs don't just identify, they also have connotations that bring associations to mind, and that's the basis of branding effectively. I'm not going to belabor the point, but obviously this Coke ribbon is very evocative of the Coca-Cola brand that of course has invested billions of dollars over the years in marketing, but this ribbon does evoke a lot of the Coca-Cola brand and products, the classicism of the bottle, the sort of Art Deco nature of some of the design motifs that they convey, and also some of the brand's values around community and togetherness and running through your life. There are a lot of meanings embedded in the Coke ribbon. And that's not to say that all these meanings are going to be present to you in your mind on a conscious level, but they do convey, they will be landing, a lot of these will be landing based upon your exposure to elements of Coca-Cola as a brand. I come on to this later, so I'm not going to go through this. Just in terms of another metaphor for semiotics, yeah, I mean, the film The Matrix, I think, is a good way of conveying one of the main functions of semiotics, which is to see through the froth, the superficiality that we see, and pierce deeper to the deeper patterns that that sort of govern consumer culture, our behavior, ideologies, and various other things that govern our behavior. So the matrix is a good metaphor. Just in terms of my approach to semiotics, I mean, I believe that it's a real honor and privilege to be practicing semiotics, but I believe engaging in brand semiotics and applied semiotics, you need a sort of a panoply of skills. So yes, I'm a consultant and I offer high quality consultancy and based on rigorous semiotic thinking to my clients and their agencies to close the gap between what they think they're communicating and what they're actually communicating. I'm, an academic, or at least I publish academically and read pretty voraciously in the world of semiotics. So I seek to create a feedback loop between the world of applied and academic semiotics. I'm not one of these brand semioticians that comes onto a call and when they're faced with a audience of marketers is desperate to sort of dumb things down. I'm not a believer in that. I'm a believer in a distillation of the ore of semiotic thinking into something that is workable and applicable rather than making things superficial. I'm also a creative, primarily a writer, poet, performer, and I'm really into humor as well. And I think showing rather than telling is what semiotics needs to do in order to demonstrate its value and gain more traction within the brands and marketing community. So what I'm going to do is go into a few slides on case studies, and I guess as Sally suggested, I'm going to rattle through these fairly swiftly, and just give you a flavour of the sorts of problems that semiotics is brought in to solve. Now, I was writing down, doing an audit of some of the inquiries I've had in more recently, and they vary from logo screening for an entertainment company in the US, which is a sort of direct competitor of Disney parks, screening logos and giving them cultural insight into the potential meanings and the likely reactions within a broad American public to certain sort of visual isotopes and tropes. And I've had inquiries from regulators around the increase in violence and graphic content in TV content, and how semiotics can help them understand that change over the last 10 years to create regulations. I've been approached by a law firm to look at the strength of the case they might have to argue essentially transgression of IP and design rights between one brand of spirits and another. So those are the sorts of inquiries I might be approached with on a weekly basis. Live music and euphoria and how you can brand that. All sorts of different weird and wonderful case studies. I've chosen some case studies that are sort of slightly older. They're not, they're still very relevant to what we do today, but just in terms of client confidentiality, I'm sure you're appreciative of that. We all need to keep our clients happy, and being confidential around their work is important. So the first case study is around nation branding, and it's a project that I did with good clients of mine in Latin America. So in Mexico, so it was about branding Mexico. So I'm not going to sort of read this brief as such, but I thought what I would do is give you a taste of the sorts of briefs. I always think, when I'm writing a debrief, I don't know how it is with you, but I like to try and really re-immerse myself in the reality of the situation, which is I have a client who's, really in need of help and wants assistance. And I think it's a real focus of the mind to do that. So this was around a project for Brand Mexico, which is essentially a country that wanted to engage in some country branding. And as we know, all countries seek to engage in this, not just because they're competing for Monocle's soft power index, although increasing soft power is a big part of branding a nation, because you want to attract direct investment, tourism, foreign students, overseas students, and as well as project a positive image on the world stage. So this was a change in government where the old government, the revolutionary government, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI, could come back. And the new president wants to kind of know what he should be saying about Mexico. Slightly worrying in a way, but it was a syndicate of of government agencies and brands who wanted to understand globally what Mexico meant. And the leader of the project is a big fan of Umberto Eco, worked with Semiotics, does Semiotics himself, and he was working with me on other projects. So he brought me in to manage this project. And the project was due to take place in 10 markets. And the brief was, what does Mexico mean? What are the emergent codes, as we say in Semiotics, of Mexico as a nation? It's a fascinating project. So what we did was we gave a brief to local analysts, which was to pull out some of the more top line associations that they believe that their market have with Mexico, as well as artifacts. We also gave them a few artifacts to look at and analyze, which was, a political ad from the president-elect, a Corona, different meanings post-COVID, of course, but this is pre-COVID. Corona ad, a popular Netflix series, La Reina de Sofia, and the Mexico logo. So they did a little analysis of that, but it was mainly a kind of culture scope, what we call in semiotics, which is a sort of trawl of desk research, data, and content. And we did it across all these markets: so France, the UK, Spain, US, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, India, Singapore, I believe, China, and Japan. And here are some of the sort of associations that came out regarding Mexico from the different analysts. And as you can imagine, your proximity to a country somewhat determines how rich your associative web is associated with that country and its values. So Spain and the US are pretty, in a sense, Spain is not close geographically, but very close linguistically and culturally. And the US close very geographically. So yeah, and this research was designed to feed into some creative ideation strategic ideation, around the brand positioning that Mexico should investigate. And the map we put together, on my course, I talk about the code map as a really fundamental part of doing semiotics, which it is. It's a really important part of, how we return the findings back to the client in a succinct manner that helps them make decisions. And I thought this was a very directive one, where we effectively pulled out the different associations with brand Mexico in different markets, and we sort of bucketized them, if I can use that word. We put them into groups of 2. So the markets where Mexico was quite positive but quite distant, and this was the UK and France, where we suggested that they needed to nuance and variegate the message. There were markets where Mexico was rather unknown, but there was more of a positive relationship, or there was the potential. It was kind of a neutral with a kind of slight positive lean in terms of the polarity of opinion and cultural resonance. And in that sense, there was just a sense in which Mexico was a sort of an ancient Amerindian culture or mestizo culture and needed to contemporize. These markets, Singapore and India, it was about educating, because they were quite anonymous. Markets where I think there were associations for I don't know why the associations came so much from Saudi, but from Brazil, this idea of the quite dirty and dangerous country. So it was about combating stereotypes. And in Spain and the US, it was more about an ambivalent, enmeshed relationship that needed to be managed, because the associations were so strong, you can't really change them, but it's about management of the associations. We came up with about 6 different territories, areas like Baroque maximalism, sort of transgressive freshness. There are a number of others, but one was sort of this idea of X marks the spot. And this was around, the sense of there's a lot of transgressive energy within Mexico, hedonistic, quite a dark sense of humor, kind of a festive morbidity, as epitomized by the Day of the Dead. But also this idea of the X being kind of a North American country, is also Latin America, that has a sort of liminal space. Anyway, the agency really ran with that, and there was a couple of things. The X strategy was adopted by the Mexican government, and they went as far as designing the X shape airport, which I believe was a Norman Foster designed for Mexico City Airport, that when the socialist government came back in, the government of AMLO, Lopez Obrador, he cancelled the X-shaped airport, which forever deprived me of an opportunity to point down as I was sort of coming in for a landing over Mexico City and saying that was a semiotics project that led to that. But never mind. There was a really good book called The X of Mexico that my client wrote off the back of this research and other stuff, which is, has really helped the Mexican Tourist Board in their work. So had a benefit in that regard. So we're just going to go into the next case study. You do collect any questions and put them in the chat. Our next case study has also had an international scope, but this was around brand refresh. This was a project for Kellogg's, and it was really around a brand that was stagnating, and I wanted to ensure the long-term stability and success by changing the trajectory of the trajectory of the brand across markets. And as a starting point, they wanted to better understand this idea of simplicity. And I guess this was, if you think about timing, it's the beginning of 2012, so it was a time where the slow move food movement had been around a while. The experience economy was really taking shape, and this idea of experiences, provenance of food, not on the label, books like that. I don't know if it come out in 2012, but it was that kind of groundswell of interest in provenance and food as well. And I guess in a way, Kellogg's was still a sort of 1980s Cocoa Poppy kind of Frosties type brand with perhaps some rather kind of processed food connotations. And they both had a twin prong, which is they had the developing markets to think about, but also the developed markets as well. So they wanted to understand the codes, and they used the word symbology. Please don't use the word symbology. It's a made-up word that came from the Da Vinci Code. So symbolism, if you're going to use a word to do with that, it sounds gimmicky. Anyway, they wanted to look at all aspects of simple, which was a big task. So with a big culture scope like this, and as I say, I haven't got time to sort of outline the methodology in great detail, but there were three prongs to the research. So on the one hand, there was briefing the local analysts in different markets to pull out iconic packaging that had a kind of simple, classic schema, and do a cultural analysis of what appealed to that market as a way of extrapolating simple in terms of visual design. Then we had a look at what simple was at a sort of a bigger level, a sort of a more top-down level, speaking to philosophers, food experts, economists, transmedia experts, and a number of other experts, including, we looked at classic packaging as well as more emergent packaging, and did some signifier analysis. This was what was done in the UK, but we had this done across the markets. But we also spoke with experts, amongst whom were the eminent product designer and I guess cognitive scientist in a way of design and interfaces, Donald Norman, who some of you will know, and one of the best book covers ever produced for this book, The Design of Everyday Things, showing what not to do. And from Donald, whom I interviewed over Skype, as it was back then, we got the notion of this idea of managed complexity, or simplexity, as you could call it, which is essentially that there's objective simplicity and there's kind of subjective or culturally determined simplicity. So it may be true that one button for an iPod is really simple because it's minimal, but actually to get that to work and have to push it 5 times for one function, 7 times for another function, it actually becomes more complex than having more buttons on it. Also, another metaphor would be, you might find a jumbo jet dashboard really confusing, but a pilot will find it, absolutely like sinking into a warm bath because they're familiar with it. They've been conditioned to understand it. And that also happens at a cultural level. This idea of kind of culturally determined simplicity was a big overarching theme we took into the rest of the research. I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but suffice to say that simple isn't as simple as you might think when you start projecting it out globally. So, everything in France to do with, Baroque and Enlightenment simplicity and how there are different design styles associated with it when you start thinking about architecture and fashion. The UK, the pragmatic culture, pragmatism. the US, this idea of purity and Puritanism, in Mexico, kind of a Baroque Catholicism, and India, this idea of simplicity being anathema to the Indian spirit effectively, but this idea of mother love or purity. So there are different ways in which packaging actually conveys purity, and South Africa the same. So overall insights were in more developed markets, risk-based post-traditional societies where there's more clutter of life and there's more cognitive overload, and maybe a sense of wanting to slow down and be more sustainable rather than move up a hierarchy. There's a greater sense of simplicity being about honesty, craft, and authenticity. Developing markets, and I guess you could see a parallel to sustainability discourse globally and why it's so difficult to translate that the same message across the world. Developing markets tend to see simplicity as being hollow, bereft, lacking substance. And so there's sort of a way of thinking about simplicity and how you convey it on pack, escaping from poverty versus escaping complexity, and how those lead to the different sort of design schema. It took Kellogg's a little while to move on their packaging, but they eventually did a few years after the project was done. I know a few other projects were done by others that led into that, but yeah, they adopted they elected to increase the size of their font and be a bit more playful with it in terms of being cut off. They started to create a kind of visual schema in terms of the bowl being center, not in the center of the pack, but being planted front and center, and coherence across the brands in order to create a more simple kind of schema, and started to rationalize their portfolio. I mean, it wasn't, as you'll know with your clients, it wasn't exactly what we said, but I tend to think of working with a client as kind of moving a big oil tanker. You need to push them a lot for them to sort of start iterating in the right direction. And I think that's what we enable them to do through semiotics and cultural insight. So I know I'm rattling through these, but as I say, it's much more of a amuse-bouche is probably too trivializing what I'm presenting. These are really, I think, really great, really substantial case studies that all had a tangible impact on the client, and they were very happy with. But yeah, it's obviously a very compressed account of what we did. So we've been through, sort of a cultural branding and a brand refresh, which was focused on packaging principally. And now we're going to go on to sort of look at content strategy, because media houses have also become wise to how they need to really think about cultural factors in planning, commissioning content. And I've been lucky enough to have done a number of such projects in the last few years. So this was a project for the BBC. The objective of this work was to effectively better fulfill their charter, their charter imperatives and the Reithian ethos of inform, educate, and entertain, but also do so by making sure you're catering to the entire UK population. And there was a brief that came in that wanted to help them produce some original content, but also screen for gross negatives, factual and entertainment content for its resonance with what were then called BAME audiences. So BAME was an acronym that's since been slightly discredited, but it's sort of Black, Asian, multi-ethnic, or Middle Eastern, depending on your particular flavor of that acronym. But they effectively wanted to understand, get a series of genre-specific and cross-genre guidelines for program makers and marketers to help them broaden the appeal of BBC content to what they said BAME audiences. I mean, again, ideally it would be good to sort of say a little bit about why semiotics is, in a way, the perfect or a very important, very useful tool for some of these briefs, and why other methodologies struggle. I think in this particular case, understanding not only cultural factors but subcultural factors. You have a situation where you have a mainstream culture and you have people that belong to that mainstream culture, but there are various levels of assimilation and acculturation within that culture, or even marginalization, and that could affect the way certain content lands. So we worked with a qualitative research agency, actually Croft. I don't know if you know Conrad, but I think he might be a member of the ICG. Excellent chap. Worked with him on a number of projects, and so they did the qual, and with Conrad, you always going to get the best. And Alex, really good, fantastic quality work. And I was tasked with doing the semiotics to work alongside him. So we very much work together, and that, just for the qualitative researchers on the call, I mean, I worked at Flamingo for, well, it was, yeah, how long was it? 8 years, yeah. So yeah, I've done a lot of qualitative research in my time globally as well as in the UK. This project was massive. The first thing we needed to do is going to get a snapshot of the development of, different diasporic communities in the UK. So that's, Black Caribbean, Black African, South Asian, which, as you will know, the deeper you get into something, the more splintered and vociferous it gets, the more the more you see, and vice versa. And of course, you've got the Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi, who are very different culturally, share some things, but there's a lot of differences, particularly as it pertains to the UK and the dominant culture with, so yeah. So we had a trajectory across these years, 70s and 80s, 90s and 2000s, 2000s to present, for each of these groups, kind of schematic. So that was done through expert interviews and desk research. And obviously, when you have an analysis team, it does help to have, I personally always feel, and my experience is such, that the best combination for any semiotics project is a curious, naive observer and someone that's immersed in the culture. And in a way, being mixed race, I consider myself to be both on this project, because there's things I identify as a person of colour. I feel British, but I'm also different and more and less and all, whatever you want to, however you want to cast it. And so, yeah, I have that insight. But I think on general, on projects and working abroad as well, it's really good to have a cultural insider and a cultural outsider, and that gives you a really solid, balanced view. So having done that, we started to think about what Stuart Hall, this theorist on the right, who is the coiner of the word Thatcherism, founder of the New Left movement in the UK, one of the founders of New Left Review, and someone that thought very deeply about society as a sociologist and also a semiotician. And he had this notion of that the codes that are propagated by a mainstream culture would not necessarily be uncritically adopted, that there could be uncritical adoption by those that were absolutely belonging squarely to the mainstream culture and what's called the broadcast code. But then there's different gradations of negotiation with that code. So there's receptivity, which doesn't mean in critical adoption, but it means receptivity, and the assimilated within the BAME group. Those assimilated, and you could think of third generation Indians living in Solihull as a kind of very extreme example of that. Who identifies in some cases as white British, as that acculturated, negotiated. This is, I'd say probably the sweet spot would be, could be, I mean, I don't want to stereotype, but yeah, typically Black Caribbean in the UK, aspects of, and then marginalised opposition or, more recent immigrants to the UK, people of colour from maybe the Horn of Africa or North Africa, etc. So they're going to be, not maybe have quite as good an input into the language, won't be as acculturated, won't have the command of English. And so we have to find a gradation of different subcultures in terms of receptivity. And again, look, I'd love to go through the whys and wherefores and all the sort of logical inferences and syllogisms we made from the broad cultural trajectory looked at, as well as looking at the different groups, subculture groups. By the way, what we were given, just to be clear, what we were given to look at was, I think 40 or 50 pieces of content, which was fact and entertainment, some of which was had over-indexed with a BAME target, and some of which had under-indexed, dramatically. And therefore, there was a strong hypothesis that there was something either they were doing very right, not only the B, but other channels, and something they were doing very wrong. And so we did a content analysis alongside this cultural analysis. It's quite a full-on project. Just to give you the net of this, as I say, in the interest of time, we came up with a series of dampeners and drivers. So these are levers, right? There were 14 levers. 6 of them were dampeners, 8 of them were drivers. So the dampeners these are things that are likely to dampen engagement when people are watching mainstream content. These are within the BAME targets. You've got numerical tokenism, top left, which is, you've got one of a person of colour, and it's kind of obvious that maybe they're just there for a quota, the suspicion. There's cultural misrepresentation, where you conflate two cultures as being a Chinese and Japanese example of East Asian cultures, particularly lack of literacy and representing those cultures on TV, and a lot of laziness. Cultural stereotyping and cultural appropriation, these are ones that are likely to disengage people a lot more. So these are, peddling stereotypes of certain cultural groups that are pejorative, seen as pejorative, and cultural appropriation without challenge are likely to disengage people from content. And then the sort of more egregious aspects that are likely to alienate people from the get-go and maybe not even mean that they're put off even engaging is what we call exclusionary codes. So these are ways in which the content says it's not for them, this is not for you, and in two ways in this case, which was class-based. It's the UK, class-based, right? That's the the big taboo, but still a massive driver of the way British culture shows up. So, I guess establishment and working class exclusionary codes that for BAME people maybe don't feel as engaging. But frankly, look, it's just TV. I get it. It's TV. No one's having going into anaphylactic shock because of a title of a TV program or something that happens. But it's just that it's a combination of these dampeners, but it's also that the programs that have these dampeners tend to also lack certain drivers. And so it's like an away from and a towards in a symbiotic web. So you've got your skin in the game. These are things that tend to drive interest in mainstream British content, in factual and entertainment content. So skin in the game, stuff where there's a protagonist who's a person of colour you can root behind. Inside a point of view, which is where it's all the money and the lead author, the auteur of the piece is a person of colour rather than being done from outside. Learning opportunities, the immigrant drive to always learn, to always be bettering yourself. Which is why The Apprentice does better than I'm a Celebrity, because the tasks just seem to be trivial and pointless. Rawness and expose, anything that's raw, that exposes power structures, again, will appeal to this group. Glamour and swagger, different ways of showing up in the world that are a bit more extroverted and out there. Centrality and agency, very connected to inside a point of view. Nuance and complexity in terms of representation, obvious cues that matter to people in this target group. And then textual cues, which are subtle cues, could be music, could be engagement with digital culture, things that convey social currency with certain types of media. Those are the drivers. And I think it's fair to say a show like I May Destroy You, HBO, BBC, co-production, written and starring Michaela Cole, pretty piece of genius, really, very daring piece of work. And when you analyze it for these dampeners and drivers, it's absolutely replete with them. And so I did a piece to share with the client as an example of, and I know it influences the commissioning process and the way people think. The report was actually cited by the BBC Trust in the work they did with the government post the murder of George Floyd, in the wake of his murder and the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020, and it has influenced commissioning as well. So yeah, that's where the work went and how it informed work, commissioning. So just going to finish with this. So media understanding, I guess this is kind of connected with. I guess this is connected with. I think my mic may have dropped out there for a sec. Connected with content, but it's more about the media that you use to communicate. And this was a project for Radio Centre, which is about conducting a wide-ranging project in order to help choose music to match with brand communications. The purpose of this was to get people in the industry to think more about music, more strategically about music, and currently decisions about music, as they found from their interviews with the sort of top 50 creative directors in the UK, were being made subjectively on the basis of likability or on the perceived popularity of the song, not on the basis of strategic fit with core brand equities or even the communication objectives. So I worked with Stephen Lacey at Push, who's a school friend of mine, someone I've worked with a number of times. He's a big fan of semiotics, and they sort of oversaw the work, and there was included face-to-face research, neurometric studies, creative workshops, a number of expert interviews, and semiotics was what they chose as the way that they were going to identify major genres of music used by brands, create some mood boards where they would match brand values to emotions and pieces of music, and generate musical examples to do that. I mean, as with a lot of the bigger projects, more challenging projects, the objective sort of morphed in terms of what was possible. And music being such an unwieldy, unpredictable entity, we had to sort of, as we discovered more, almost kind of modify the objectives to fit the research domain. But what we were given, so music's really interesting because it's a sort of acoustic fact or an acoustic phenomena that pushes, waves, sonic waves, and affects us, our human sensorium, not only our inner ear and the auditory canal and cortex, but also, our bodies as well. If anyone that's been to a rave or is into Jamaican bass culture will tell you. But also it has, it also has these emotional connotations. It's an emotional language. It has, it's music. It has all these associations it manages to evoke in the brain. So it's a very complex entity, and I think semiotics as an interdisciplinary perspective is really perfectly placed to understand the meaning of music in all its complexity, because you can talk to a social psychologist about the comparative popularity of Beatles albums through the 60s and correlate that with how complex the album is musically. You can talk to a psychologist about, the somatic markers associated with certain pieces of music in certain people. We can talk to a neuroscientist about the startle response in the brain, but all of those are just parceling out one section, one part of the elephant, to sort of paraphrase that ancient adage about all the experts thinking they've understood the elephant by understanding a part of it. Semiotics can actually understand the holistic entity. What we were given by the client were these words. So these are the words that tend to recur most often in briefs, in creative briefs amongst the advertising community we were canvassing back in 2015 when we did the project. And what they wanted to do was understand, like, how do you convey, for example, top left, confident in a piece of music? How do you, in advertising, what kind of music or sound do you use? What about dynamic? What about edgy? And on the feel words, galvanized, esteemed, reassured. How do you do that? And how do you justify the choice? Well, the justification of the choice was, we broke the things that influence the meaning of music into 6 parameters. So this was psychophysical factors, so the tempo, the volume, the predictability, the form of instrumentation used, the timbre, the sound effects, recording context, in terms of, where it's recorded. Is it a big room? Is it a small room? What the acoustics like? The tonal character, which is, if you study music, is often probably what musicologists and scholars will primarily go to when they think about music, particularly the classical tradition: the keys, the pitch, harmony, major and minor keys, etc. Then there's sonic metaphors, which is how the music is embodied, which is tightly linked to instrumentation and tonal character, but it also can be quite different. The genre marker, which genres and what the connotations and associations have with different genres, and then intertextuality, which is a kind of more complex, more nuanced cultural associations and allusions in pieces of music, for example, certain anthems or certain football chants or certain songs associated with certain cultures, subcultures that have certain meanings. So yeah, those were the 6 parameters, and for each parameter, yes, we went there. For each parameter, we broke down what specifically is likely to convey those words, and this is just for the feel words here. And then for each of these cells, we had, for each of the words, we had 5 pieces of music, and we broke down each piece of music in terms of which of these parameters it used to convey the meaning. What we learned was that music is not purely subjective. There's certain elements of music give certain effects. Deconstructing music using these 6 parameters enables more objective debate about what communication requires in terms of a piece of music, and it allows individual songs to be linked more directly to specific brand associations. And the project ended up with this kind of interactive website, which you can still use, called Brand Music Navigator, which is a fantastic way of playing with different pieces of music according to different words and different adjectives. So I'm just going to end by just talking through the reflections I've made about the sorts of problems that semiotics is most amenable to solving. So anything to do with the subconscious factors, where people are going to either find something difficult to talk about, or they're going to find it difficult to almost apprehend what it is they should be talking about when discussing something, either because it hasn't been invented yet, it's an innovation piece, or because there's a cultural taboo, or because it's so ubiquitous it's hard to see. All of those things are really useful to be thought about semiotically. Brand fundamentals, when you're doing fundamental brand building work, either creating a brand from scratch or refreshing a brand where it's about the name, the logo, the colors. Semiotics is really about the building blocks of meaning. So it is something that should really be brought in when you're building a brand from scratch. It can have the most effect upstream. Cultural change, anything to do with cultural change, ideology is a particular facet of that at the moment. Semiotics is really useful at tracking that and helping equip you with the tools and help situate where the brand is, where the competitors are, and where you could move. Anything to do with aesthetics, anything to do with aesthetics and arts, semiotics is really good at understanding different art movements and different cultural references in those, and how those will be more or less relevant, whether it be special editions or co-sponsorship or any projects along with those lines. It is interdisciplinary, so as I've said with the music example, anything that's sort of interdisciplinary in terms of its the way it needs to be addressed. So I've worked a lot with behavioral science, for example, and projects. Semiotics plays very nice with most methodologies. So when there's jeopardy attached to meaning as well, by which I mean, I alluded to being approached by an intellectual property lawyer around the case to do with the contravention of IP, of core IP in terms of the packaging of two spirits brands. And there's a lot at stake there. And I have done one expert witness project outside the UK, which was very political actually, and it was a fascinating project. And semiotics is brought in when you need non-arbitrary creativity, when you need justification for your choices as well. And also, finally, the intractable problems, the problems which have been around the block, you've been around the block with, you've tried other research methodologies, you've been through a number of iterations and you can't break out the loop. Semiotics is a really good way of breaking out the loop. So yeah, I specialize in creative problem solving for brands, and we produce inspiring work to help companies express strategic direction and creative expression. We do base our work on semiotics and turn culture into design strategy and culturally grounded communications, help with brand creative and brand strategy, brand innovation work, and creative evaluation and global intelligence. So yeah, do get in touch, and thanks very much for your attention.
That was really fascinating, Chris. Thanks very much indeed. Does anybody have any questions for Chris? Please, if you either write them in the chat box, or else turn on your webcam, raise your hand to ask a question. Right, so somebody's requested details of your course, Chris. Do you want to give a little bit more information on that?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So I run a course called How to Do Semiotics in 7 Weeks. So it is, I think, one of the best learning experiences you can have with semiotics. The reason is it's been researched very thoroughly. And yeah, I'm on the 8th cohort of that now. So I've had about 160, 70 students from all around the world. So what I do is I take you from a newbie or elementary level all the way through to be able to produce a code map in 7 weeks with a cohort of brand communication professionals from around the world. We meet on Thursdays generally. We've just finished our 9 a.m. cohort this week when we started this webinar. We run 2 cohorts on a Thursday, and we're starting on the 27th. We run quarters every year, Q1, Q2, and Q4. So we start end of January, end of April, end of October. So either mail me for more details, or Pavla Hines, who's the course coordinator.
Fantastic. Any other questions? What's to take on board, particularly with the international lens? Okay, that's great. Any particular questions? Otherwise, I've got one. I'm very interested to hear a little bit more about the interdisciplinary comment that you made, saying that you've used semiotics with behavioral science. So can you give a brief example of how that can work?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I see behavioral science as being understanding the levers of influence that marketing messages specifically have. So I do see semiotics as semiotics is the conscience of meaning when it comes to brands. Okay, so what I mean by that is brands want to communicate. In a brand book, it says, this is what the font means, this is what the color means. But when the brand's out in the world, there tends to be a friction because of culture, and there tends to be like a mismatch between what the brand wants to communicate and what it actually communicates. So semiotics is definitely about aligning brand meaning, so core identity, core brand messaging. But when you think about campaigns and punching out the meaning of campaigns and user interfaces, for example, a website, behavioral science is really useful because it thinks about the framing of messages. It thinks about like how many choices should there be? When do you hit cognitive overload on a shelf, for example? How do we prime somebody to really look at this brand for the first time? Thinking about things like loss aversion. So, give you an example. Doing a project in the insurance category where it's quite a low involvement category, you need to be aware of the branding. So the branding will say, this is for me, in terms of the brand messages and the associations and the brand image. But the behavioral science will be more granular about the messaging, about where the messaging appears, how it appears, the sequence in which it appears, how the configuration of the messaging, and how you write copy in order to kind of punch up the message. So I see semiotics, as I say, as being about the core meanings, the core associations associated with any brand, but behavioral science is about optimizing the efficiency of messaging. Hopefully that makes some sense to you.
Yep, absolutely. A couple more questions have come through. Is it possible to give broad costs for presumably that's the training course? For conducting something on brand logo work, etc. in the UK. So that's project work, not the training.
I think it's probably something I'd rather sort of take offline and have a discussion with that individual if you're interested. The way I charge is a combination of day rate and also piecework, by which I mean I'm also aware of kind of where a piece of work will live within a company and what it does. And obviously there are some pieces of work that, and also in terms of how much I invest and how definitive I need to be in terms of the conclusions and where it's going. So clearly an expert witness work for a government in Europe is going to be the standard of rigor I need to bring to that is going to be much higher than even kind of a brand refresh. So it has to be charged for accordingly. It's a combination of time, where it is in the value equation, and the kind of the standards of rigor and proof I need to bring to the table. But I'm more than happy to have a chat offline about any projects that you might have or questions about projects. Yeah, because I've done so much work, so I was only able to really give you a very, very small selection today, and at speed. So.
Okay, another question. Can I get a copy of your PowerPoint and the explanation script on the music case study? So we've got your PowerPoint. Are we allowed to share it? Can we put that on the website, or would you rather we didn't do that?
I can send you something. I'm probably going to have to redact some information, but yeah, I can definitely send you something for circulation. With regard to the music case study, yeah, thanks for asking about that. What I can share is the Brand Music Navigator URL, and also I did write a paper on the process that I went through. So I'm happy to share that with the individual that has that question.
Fantastic, thank you.
Will you be capturing this information, Sally, by the way?
So John, could you send an email to Lucy, and then we can follow up on that? Okay, another question from Brian. Similar to the behavioural science question, how does it intersect and or complement research that incorporates neurobiological feedback?
Yeah, good question. I did some research with NeuroInsights, who do ECG they do steady state topography measures of the brain, mainly with regard to approach withdrawal, attention, and long-term memory encoding. So there are definitely ways semiotics can improve the sort of textual and creative literacy of the research design in terms of what you put into research. And I've spoken with Phil Barden of Decoded, who has done some great work in this field around implicit response and how you work, for example, on a logo screening. I think a great way of working is looking at the sort of semiotics providing the how and why, and implicit response providing the kind of which and to what extent in terms of like speed of association, for example. So I think it's a way of semiotics can generate options that can be put into neurometrics research, but I also believe semiotics can improve the literacy. So, for example, rather than putting in 3 different soundtracks that actually semiotically are probably going to be quite similar, actually choosing different soundtracks that are likely to convey different sort of areas of meaning with regard to the brand and what the brand's able to convey. So, for example, invigoration, you maybe get a bossa nova, a drum and bass, and like a electro swing track, for example, rather than something that's a bit samey. And also with visuals as well, in terms of the sequencing of visuals, commutation tests, various other ways of thinking about how the sequence might affect response. So those are the conclusions that my study came up with. But yeah, I'm more than happy to chat further on that.
So another question on the music study. Did you look at the difference between live performance and recorded music?
Not specifically, no, but I would say live performance, probably the parameters it would affect most, just thinking on the fly here, would be psychophysical and the instrumentation, because the psychophysical is about how we experience, it could be the same notes, but how we experience it in the room is going to be more euphoria. There's a sense of improvisation, a sense of anticipation and electricity that you can't replicate in terms of the physical sensorium and how aroused we are, not sexually probably, but in terms of the euphoria and exhilaration in the room, rather than sitting in our slippers on a Sunday and listening to the music on radio, Radio 6 music. So it would definitely affect psychophysical, but probably also the instrumentation in terms of the timbre, because being in a room, music sounds different, right? Because it's bouncing off the walls. There's certain acoustic factors you need to take into consideration. But we were seeking to create a level playing field, because this was music that was going to be used in the same context. So it would be used in radio advertising or TV advertising. So.
Okay, any more questions? I think I've gone through everything that came through the chat box. Anybody want to turn on their webcam and ask a final question? No?
Would be nice to see some faces. Everyone's very
very shy.
Everyone's very anonymous. Very anonymous. I was a bit worried, but you've given me some nice questions. That's something.
Brilliant. We've got one face there.
Richard's a brave one. Oh, John Paul Petty down there. Hello. We have a few people on the line. So yeah, look, it's been an absolute pleasure. Do send me a LinkedIn connection request on LinkedIn. I'm not on any other social media, but I am on LinkedIn. As I say, I'm more than happy to get any inquiries commercially, just about semiotics generally, about SemiaFest, or my forthcoming course, How to Do Semiotics in 7 weeks, which kicks off on Thursday next week. So yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. Really fascinating presentation. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks for logging in. Do join us for our next webinar. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye. Take care. Bye.